It started as a normal Tuesday morning, sunlight spilling across my driveway, birds chirping, coffee in hand. But by 8:17 a.m., everything had changed. HOA Karen was standing in the middle of my private driveway like she owned it, arms crossed, glaring as if I had personally insulted her existence. "You can't park there," she shrieked, phone in hand, ready to call every authority she could think of. I blinked. Did she really just claim my legally owned, clearly marked private driveway as hers? I had seen this type before, loud, entitled, unwavering in the belief that rules bend around their whims. But I'd never experienced it up close, never had someone literally refuse to move while citing rules that didn't exist. And yet, there she was, glaring, tapping her phone like it was a sword. I took a deep breath, thinking maybe calm reasoning could work. "Karen, this is my property. You can't block my driveway. There's a gate and a sign," I said evenly. She ignored me. "The HOA said," she started, before I held up my hand. "The HOA has no jurisdiction over private driveways. I have paperwork. I can show you." She scoffed, dismissing documents as if reality were optional. At that moment, I realized reasoning wouldn't work. It never did with people like her. Karen thrived on control, volume, and intimidation, not facts. So, I did what anyone who values their sanity would: I documented everything. Phone camera out, I recorded her ranting, pointing, yelling at me, while neighbors peered curiously from behind curtains. Every gesture, every demand, every phone tap was caught. I knew this would matter later. The tension escalated when she decided it wasn't enough to just block the driveway. She started arranging cones, small barricades, and even strategically placing her car to make leaving my own home a challenge. I could feel my patience thinning, my blood pressure rising. But I held steady, refusing to engage in a shouting match. Instead, I calmly filmed, kept my voice low, and mentally planned the next moves. And then she did the unthinkable. Pulling out her phone with shaking fingers, she dialed 911, screaming to the dispatcher that I was illegally using the driveway and refusing to comply with HOA rules. My jaw dropped. This was the moment I realized I had to snap, not in anger, but in strategy. I couldn't let this continue unchecked. Little did Karen know, the next moves would expose her pattern, protect my property, and completely turn the tables. This wasn't just a driveway dispute, it was the beginning of a storm she never saw coming. As Karen continued her phone tirade, I remained calm, recording every second. Neighbors peeked out their windows, whispers growing into a low murmur of curiosity. Some shook their heads, others smirked, everyone sensing the absurdity of her theatrics. I knew I had to stay composed. Reacting with anger would only give her the satisfaction she craved. I approached her carefully, keeping my distance. "Karen, you're on private property. You can't call the police over this," I said, voice steady. She ignored me completely, waving the phone in the air and shouting about rules that didn't exist. It was surreal, like watching someone live in their own fantasy world, where facts bend and entitlement reigns supreme. Within minutes, the police arrived, lights flashing, creating a surreal suburban tableau. Karen's expression shifted from fury to triumph. "See? They're coming to arrest him," she shouted, spinning the story in real time. The officers stepped out cautiously, scanning the driveway, noting the cones, the barricades, and Karen's animated gestures. One officer approached me first, asking for my side. Calmly, I explained that this was my private driveway, legally owned, clearly marked, with no violation of HOA rules. I handed over my paperwork, property deeds, HOA bylaws, photographs of previous driveway disputes, and emails confirming that HOA had no authority over private driveways. Karen jumped in repeatedly, cutting me off, insisting I was threatening her, breaking rules, and acting dangerously. Her volume was high, but her facts were non-existent. The officer politely asked her to step back and explain her claims. She pivoted, pointing at my house, then at the driveway, then at the sky, weaving a story so convoluted that even she might have struggled to follow it. Meanwhile, I remained calm, answering questions with precision and handing over the requested documents. A neighbor came forward mid-discussion, quietly explaining to the officers that Karen had a history of escalating minor disputes, filing false complaints, and targeting multiple neighbors. The officers exchanged glances, taking note. Karen's confidence faltered slightly, but she doubled down, insisting she was defending the neighborhood. It was clear that the officers weren't buying her story. By the time the situation settled, the officers had issued Karen a warning about frivolous emergency calls, while confirming my rights to access and use my driveway freely. Her face flushed with frustration, her authority evaporating under scrutiny. The neighbors, now fully awake to her antics, whispered among themselves, impressed by my composure and thorough preparation. This confrontation wasn't over, but one thing was clear: Karen's strategy of intimidation was crumbling. And the next moves I had planned would push her further off balance, exposing her obsession with control in ways she could never anticipate. Karen's fury didn't dissipate after the police left; if anything, it intensified. That evening, I noticed her standing across the street, arms crossed, glaring at my driveway like a hawk circling its prey. She wasn't planning to let this go quietly. She thrived on drama, control, and forcing others to submit to her arbitrary rules. The following morning, I received a sharply worded letter from the HOA. Karen had taken it upon herself to escalate the situation, claiming I had intimidated a board member and violated community standards by standing my ground. The wording was aggressive and misleading, as usual. I read it carefully, noting each claim, each misrepresentation, each attempt to manipulate perception. I knew that responding with precision and evidence would be crucial. I began compiling a comprehensive packet: photographs of the driveway clearly marked as private, screenshots of previous HOA emails confirming boundaries, recordings of Karen's confrontations, and even witness statements from neighbors who had seen her repeated harassment. Every piece of evidence reinforced the same truth: she had no authority, and I had every right. When the HOA board convened to review Karen's complaint, she arrived with folders and printed emails, prepared to argue her case. She presented her claims passionately, believing her volume equaled authority. I calmly presented my documentation, walking the board through each incident, showing timestamps, verified claims, and historical patterns of her behavior. The contrast was stark: facts versus fury. Neighbors had begun attending meetings in greater numbers, curious about Karen's antics. They watched her interruptions and rants in disbelief. One by one, the board members nodded toward my evidence, reinforcing the weight of documented truth. Karen tried to interrupt, but her voice now sounded frantic, disjointed. She was no longer in control. The board voted unanimously: no action against me, and a formal censure issued to Karen for harassment and repeated misuse of HOA processes. Her face drained of color. She stormed out, slamming doors, her authority shattered before everyone who had witnessed the proceedings. Her attempts to dominate through fear and entitlement had failed. Outside, neighbors approached me quietly, thanking me for standing firm. They expressed relief that someone had finally challenged Karen with patience, preparation, and evidence. I realized then that confrontation wasn't just about defending my driveway, it was about setting a precedent, showing the community that manipulation and intimidation would not prevail. Karen's power had been dismantled, but the real story was only beginning. The next moves would cement the lesson she had refused to learn: authority built on fear and lies cannot withstand clarity, documentation, and composure. Karen wasn't finished, though her tactics had shifted. Instead of yelling in person, she started posting online on the HOA forum, spinning a story about harassment and illegal driveway use. Her posts were long, dramatic, and filled with half-truths, but now, neighbors were reading with skepticism. Years of her behavior had left a pattern that was easy to spot. I documented everything. Screenshots of posts, timestamps, comments, and replies, all stored carefully. I replied once, politely, citing facts and HOA bylaws, making it clear that private driveways were not under her control. The tone was calm, neutral, and firm. Unlike Karen, I didn't need to scream to make my point. The board took notice. They issued a formal warning that misuse of HOA communication channels could result in suspension of privileges. Karen erupted, posting more aggressively, but her credibility had already been eroded. Her usual audience was shrinking, as neighbors now discussed facts instead of drama. Then, a new HOA meeting was scheduled to discuss general neighborhood policies. Karen tried to dominate the conversation again, but the chair stopped her immediately, citing previous warnings and documentation. She shouted that she was protecting the neighborhood, but no one listened. The room had shifted. Her intimidation tactics no longer worked. Outside, neighbors whispered about her behavior. Some admitted that they had previously feared confronting her. Now, watching the legal warnings, the documented evidence, and the board's response, they realized that manipulation and aggression were powerless against preparation and patience. Karen's pattern was exposed for everyone to see. Later that week, I installed small reflective signs marking the driveway clearly as private property. Simple, visual, irrefutable. Karen drove past, glared, then left without confrontation. The signs weren't about defiance, they were about clarity. Rules, boundaries, and evidence mattered more than noise. Over the next month, her attempts dwindled. Fewer posts. Less drama. The occasional complaint that reached the board was dismissed immediately with references to documentation and bylaws. Karen's control had evaporated entirely. The neighborhood, once tense under her shadow, now functioned with transparency and respect. Neighbors shared resources, discussed issues rationally, and looked out for one another. What had started as a driveway dispute had evolved into a lesson for the entire community: preparation, patience, and evidence triumph over entitlement and chaos. Karen had tried to dominate through fear. But in the end, her tactics failed, and the real victory wasn't just mine, it was the community's. Peace had returned, boundaries were respected, and everyone could finally breathe without the constant tension she had imposed. Karen's departure from direct confrontation didn't mean she disappeared entirely. She began quietly selling her house, posting for sale signs in the yard and occasionally glancing at my driveway as if hoping for one last showdown. But by now, her pattern of intimidation had been documented, her credibility stripped. She could no longer influence the board or neighbors with lies. As her property changed hands, the new owners arrived unaware of the neighborhood drama. They were friendly, quiet, and respectful, immediately reinforcing boundaries without confrontation. The contrast was striking. Where Karen had thrived on control and chaos, these neighbors brought calm and cooperation. It was a fresh start not just for the street but for the entire block. Meanwhile, the HOA implemented stricter protocols. Any future complaints had to include verified evidence, documentation, and multiple supporting sources. This effectively prevented a repeat of Karen's tactics. Officers and board members noted that formal warnings, clear rules, and documentation were now the foundation of neighborhood governance. The system, once vulnerable to loud personalities, was now resilient. During this period, I noticed subtle gestures of appreciation from neighbors. A wave from a driveway, a quick thank you during shared maintenance work, or small acts of assistance. The community atmosphere shifted from tension to cautious trust. The once feared driveway became a symbol not of conflict but of order and clarity. I also began teaching neighbors about documentation, preparedness, and communication. From driveway disputes to minor policy questions, I demonstrated how calm reasoning and proper records could prevent misunderstandings and manipulation. The ripple effect was evident: fewer complaints, faster resolution, and less tension. The neighborhood was learning the lessons Karen had forced upon it through chaos, but in a productive way. Karen's attempts to regain control dwindled online. Her posts grew less coherent, fewer neighbors engaged, and the HOA forum became a place for factual discussion rather than drama. The house sale removed her physical presence, and her absence from meetings allowed rational discourse to flourish. Looking back, it was clear that confrontation, preparation, and evidence had shifted the balance of power. Karen had relied on intimidation and chaos, but those tactics crumbled in the face of patience, thorough documentation, and community support. Her departure wasn't the victory, the strengthened neighborhood system was. By the time the new owners settled in, the street had transformed. Cooperation replaced fear, respect replaced tension, and clarity replaced confusion. What had started as a driveway dispute had become a blueprint for community resilience, showing that even the most entitled personalities could be neutralized with preparation, patience, and unwavering calm. Even with Karen gone, her shadow lingered briefly. A few neighbors, hesitant from past experiences, still whispered about her antics. Some feared that another Karen might appear. But the groundwork was laid: documentation, HOA protocols, and clear boundaries ensured no one could wield the same power unchecked. The neighborhood had learned to respond calmly rather than react with fear. I began holding informal discussions with residents, explaining how to handle future conflicts. Simple things: recording interactions, keeping evidence, understanding bylaws became the tools that neutralized potential drama. People were eager to learn, taking notes, asking questions, and sharing stories. Empowerment replaced anxiety. Neighbors realized they didn't need to rely on confrontation; clarity and evidence worked better. One afternoon, a minor issue arose: a contractor mistakenly parked across my driveway. Previously, this might have triggered panic or overreaction. Now, I calmly explained the mistake, documented the situation with a photo, and informed the contractor. They corrected it immediately. The lesson was clear: calm and preparation prevent chaos. The HOA, now aware of Karen's long-term influence, implemented additional reforms. Complaints had to be verified before escalation, emergency calls were filtered for credibility, and any repeated false reports could trigger fines or legal review. Patterns of harassment would no longer go unchecked. Karen's departure had catalyzed a safer, fairer system. Neighbors began sharing tools, driveway access, and even small resources like generators during outages. Where once fear of overreach ruled, trust slowly built. The street felt alive, cooperative, and proactive. Karen's absence was tangible, but the real change was cultural. People communicated openly, documented responsibly, and supported each other without fear of retaliation. Even Karen's online attempts to spin the story faded. Her forum posts became fewer and less convincing. Without an audience, entitlement loses its power. Meanwhile, the HOA's official statements clarified the rules and boundaries, leaving no room for misrepresentation. Community trust, once fragile, was steadily restored. At night, walking past the driveway, I reflected on the journey. What had started as a confrontation over a private driveway became a lesson in resilience, patience, and strategic thinking. Chaos can be loud, but calm preparation outlasts it every time. Karen's attempts to dominate taught the neighborhood the value of clarity and documentation. The street was quiet. Residents moved freely. Boundaries were respected. And while the memory of HOA Karen lingered as a cautionary tale, the neighborhood thrived under a new sense of order, confidence, and cooperation. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood continued to flourish. Without Karen's interference, small conflicts were resolved quickly and calmly. A delivery truck blocking a neighbor's driveway? Polite conversation and a photo record solved it. disputes over parking or lawn maintenance. Clear documentation and HOA rules guided decisions. The culture had shifted entirely. Neighbors began sharing knowledge proactively. Meetings were no longer battlegrounds but collaborative discussions. People brought questions about property boundaries, maintenance, and shared resources, and residents offered solutions based on facts rather than fear. The community learned that preparation and patience neutralize drama before it starts. Karen had unknowingly created a teaching moment that changed the culture permanently. The HOA board formalized new policies, requiring complaints to be substantiated with evidence and witnesses. False reports were flagged and reviewed immediately. This removed the leverage of entitlement personalities who had relied on chaos and volume. Transparency became the standard, and neighbors trusted the system because it now worked fairly. Meanwhile, Karen attempted one last online post, claiming harassment and exaggerating her version of the driveway dispute. Few neighbors engaged, most ignored her. The forum, once dominated by drama, now reflected order, calm, and mutual respect. Her influence had evaporated entirely. Patterns of entitlement were powerless when facts and systems held authority. I noticed a subtle change in myself as well. Instead of tension and anxiety about confrontation, I felt empowered. Calm reasoning, preparation, and documentation had allowed me to protect my property and set an example for the community. The experience reinforced that conflict could be neutralized without escalating into chaos. Even young neighbors noticed the change. Teens who had watched Karen's meltdowns learned the value of patience, recording events, and knowing your rights. Their curiosity became a practical lesson in responsibility and civic engagement. Karen's overreach inadvertently educated a new generation on how to handle conflict strategically. By now, Karen's old house had new owners. They were quiet, polite, and respectful of neighborhood norms. The lingering tension was gone. Where chaos had once ruled, clarity and cooperation prevailed. Residents could enjoy their homes without fear of sudden disputes or entitlement-driven confrontations. One evening, walking past my driveway, I reflected on the transformation. The confrontation with Karen had tested patience, resilience, and planning, but it had also revealed the strength of community when truth and documentation outweigh noise. Her attempts to control through fear failed because the neighborhood now had knowledge, systems, and mutual respect on its side. Peace had returned, not as a fragile ceasefire, but as a stable, lasting order. Boundaries were respected, conflicts resolved with evidence, and entitlement no longer dictated the rules. With Karen gone and the neighborhood thriving, life began to feel normal, almost serene. Streets were quiet, driveways respected, and neighbors engaged politely. Minor disagreements, like a misplaced trash bin or a delivery vehicle in the wrong spot, were now resolved calmly, with documentation if needed. The chaos that once defined the street was gone. The HOA continued its reforms. Complaints required clear evidence, and frivolous claims faced immediate review. This removed any opportunity for entitlement-driven manipulation. The board became proactive, monitoring patterns rather than reacting to noise. Residents felt empowered, knowing the system now worked for them, not against them. Karen's absence revealed how fragile peace had been under unchecked influence. I found myself advising neighbors more often. Simple strategies, photographs, timestamps, polite confrontation became essential tools. People shared tips and experiences, learning from past disputes to prevent escalation. The driveway incident had become a case study in calm, calculated conflict resolution. Where Karen had relied on intimidation, the neighborhood now relied on facts. Social dynamics also changed. People began cooperating voluntarily, sharing tools, organizing small maintenance projects, and checking in during emergencies. A sense of unity replaced the tension Karen had created. It was subtle, almost invisible at first, but unmistakable. The street was alive with collaboration instead of fear. Even online, Karen's posts dwindled. Without credibility or audience, her attempts to spin stories went unnoticed. The forum became a resource rather than a battlefield. Residents relied on facts, clear communication, and HOA guidelines, leaving no room for drama to flourish. The street had developed resilience through collective awareness. One evening, I walked past the driveway, now clearly marked and respected. Children played nearby, neighbors chatted on porches, and the atmosphere was calm. The generator sat quietly in its designated spot, a symbol not of conflict, but of preparation and responsibility. The lesson had extended beyond a single dispute. Boundaries, clarity, and evidence create lasting peace. The real victory wasn't in confronting Karen, it was in transforming the culture of the neighborhood. Entitlement and chaos no longer dictated interactions. Calm, documented action and community cooperation had won. What had started as a personal conflict over a driveway had evolved into a blueprint for neighborhood resilience. And while the memory of HOA Karen lingered as a cautionary tale, it no longer carried fear. Instead, it became a story of preparation, patience, and the enduring power of facts over volume. The neighborhood had finally found its balance, proving that even the loudest chaos can be overcome with strategy and composure. The final chapter wasn't about confrontation, it was about lasting change. Weeks turned into months, and the street continued to thrive. Neighbors communicated openly, minor conflicts were resolved calmly, and the driveway stood as a symbol of boundaries respected. Karen's influence had evaporated completely, leaving only lessons behind. The HOA continued to enforce its updated policies consistently. Any complaint had to be documented, verified, and reviewed before action. False claims were flagged immediately. Patterns of harassment were no longer tolerated. Where once loud personalities could dominate, now systems and procedures maintained order. Knowledge and preparation had become stronger than intimidation. The neighborhood atmosphere transformed. People shared resources, checked in on each other, and resolved issues without drama. Even teens and young adults observed how preparation and patience could neutralize chaos. Karen's actions, though destructive, inadvertently taught the community a lesson about resilience, strategy, and standing firm without aggression. I reflected on my own growth. The driveway incident had tested patience, composure, and strategic thinking. I had learned that evidence, calm reasoning, and clear documentation can disarm even the most entitled personality. The real victory wasn't just protecting my property, it was empowering the entire neighborhood to act rationally and assertively. The new homeowners in Karen's old house integrated seamlessly, respecting rules and boundaries without drama. The street, once tense and fearful, now functioned with mutual trust. Conversations were calm, meetings productive, and shared responsibilities clear. Entitlement no longer dictated the narrative, preparation and clarity did. Even online, HOA forums reflected the change. Karen's absence left room for factual discussion, neighborly advice, and constructive communication. The community now had a blueprint for addressing disputes: fact-based, measured, and resilient. Chaos had been replaced with order, tension with cooperation, fear with trust. Walking past my driveway one evening, I saw children playing safely, neighbors chatting, and lights glowing warmly from each house. The generator sat quietly, a symbol not of conflict but of preparedness. The lessons were clear: boundaries matter, documentation is powerful, and composure can overcome even the loudest entitlement. What had begun as a single confrontation over a driveway became a story of empowerment, strategy, and neighborhood resilience. Karen had tried to dominate with fear, we responded with patience, evidence, and unity. And in the end, the street emerged stronger, calmer, and better prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead.